And this is audio 2 of week 9. We're on slide 6. Japan played an extremely critical role in this process. They had a model which was, quite frankly, better welcomed by the countries concerned, because it was neither a U.S. model with a lot of freedoms attached, political as well as economic freedoms, social freedoms attached, nor was it the Soviet model that was not much loved outside of the socialist bloc. You can see why U.S. policymakers probably saw building up a peaceful Japanese economy as a really good move in retrospect. If you take a look at this table, by the way, you can see the scale at which Japanese capital played a role. You can see that the European Union and the United States were also quite important in the economies of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. The countries that made up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in its early stage, or ASEAN. That's pronounced ASEAN normally. People say it all sorts of different ways. But those 5 countries were the founding members of ASEAN, the association, again, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So Japan became the leading foreign investor in the 1980s and 90s, partly because, of course, they had managers who were from the region and possessed the wide-ranging industrial experience that was required to get things started in the industrialization of the countries concerned. Let's go on to slide 7. The elites, the local elites in each country, who guided and benefited from the industrialization, had more, I would say, more in common with each other across the different countries than they did with their own countrymen. They were generally educated people. They often spoke English. They felt threatened by the communist revolutions that were going on, not only in Vietnam and China, but also in Thailand and also in Malaysia, and even in Singapore and Indonesia. So they felt more friendly to the United States and to Japan than they did to some of the other countries in the region, particularly Vietnam. And quite often the people we're speaking about were Chinese who had left China. Their families, generations before, had left China and settled in the countries of Southeast Asia, and also in Korea. There is a sizable Chinese minority in Korea that you can, if you're Korean, if you speak the language, then you can tell who's who among the Chinese Koreans, just as you can tell who's who if you're Indonesian or if you're Thai or if you're Filipino, even though in most of the countries the names of Chinese immigrants over the generations have been localized to some degree. You can still tell who's who. Anyway, in the background, I should add, in most of these countries, not so much South Korea, to some degree Singapore, but more importantly and more obviously in other places like Malaysia and Indonesia, there was the development with economic success of organized crime, and we'll talk more about that as we go. Let's go on to slide 8, and you can see here that we're now going to take a look at some specific cases. On to slide 9. Perhaps the most successful and earliest example of an Asian tiger, little dragon, was the Republic of Korea. That's South Korea. It's convenient while we speak about South Korea to take some quick comparisons with North Korea, because they'll teach us about the nature of South Korean development, and will remind us that North Korea was not always in dire economic straits. Both sides received significant outside assistance in the course of their development. The North Koreans mostly from the Russians, the South Koreans mostly from the Americans and from Japan. Both Koreas had a universal draft to their armed forces and a long commitment after active duty service to reserve service, where something had to be done every month to fulfill a military obligation, sort of a part-time job arrangement. And this promoted a great deal of a military atmosphere in both societies. However, in North Korea, of course, the model that was followed was a socialist one of state-owned businesses, largely dedicated to Stalinist economic development, heavy industry, emphasis on heavy industry. That emphasis on heavy industry also existed in South Korea, but it was tempered by light industry that was brought in especially with Japanese investment, and encouraged along with that was the development of the chaebol organizations, business organizations, business conglomerates that were very much like the zaibatsu or conglomerates in Japan. Let's go on to slide 10, where we can see briefly in this graph that shows per capita annual income that North Korea kept up to some degree with the South in their successful socialist economic development through the mid-1970s. When I served in Korea as a soldier from 1979 to 1981, I was able to study North Korea to some degree, and of course I traveled around South Korea and was able to determine that the two were pretty much evenly matched when it came to industry and economic power. It was just that they had very different systems. You can see that, however, in the period after 1976, that the South Korean economy really took off. It started its rapid development under Park Chung-hee. It was stalled a bit after the 1979 military coup, but then it took off again in the democratic era, perhaps because the middle class was more at liberty to pursue economic development of its own choice, and the upper classes. Less government control on society, in other words, after Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo, who we examined last week, were taken out of the political process. And growth went up extremely quickly through most of the 1990s. Let's go on to slide 11. And here you see a summary of the government policies that the South Koreans successfully pursued. These began under Park Chung-hee, and continued as the Japanese became involved and double-digit growth took hold. This sort of double-digit growth, by the way, very important in the development of a number of nations. Double-digit growth crucial to Japan, seen in Japan in the 1960s, in Korea in the periods that we just saw on slide 10, in China after 1980 and especially in the 1990s. And perhaps we'll see that sort of double-digit growth pretty soon, for example, in Burma. I'll stop here and we'll continue with slide 12.